now I think in the last few minutes, I want to go over some of those contributing factors that we want to take into account when we have a child with fluency. And this slide just shows that there is a relationship between stuttering and language. And the relationship is that we know the motor system is vulnerable in a person who stutters, and it's vulnerable to increased linguistic demands. And here is some information about stuttering and the relationship to language that's more often at the beginning of a phrase when utterance formulation comes in. It's above a child's, it happens more above a child's MLU or on longer and more syntactically complex utterances. And the onset corresponds to a rapid language change. So we know there's a connection to language with that. Other information is that high number of children who stutter who do have a phonological impairment. So that is definitely something that may be part of an assessment. And then language they may not necessarily have a language delay, but there's a lot of research showing some uneven development, such as a high receptive language score and a low, a higher receptive vocabulary, lower expressive vocabulary, maybe word finding. So giving these things, I just threw out the test of narrative language. Your school may have particular ones that you like to give. If there's articulation concerns, perhaps Golden Fristow or the Hostin, I mean, you're all familiar with those testing things, but I want to just reiterate, it may not be a language delay. In this case study, here are the scores I got. I did these scores. There was a significant discrepancy between some of these. Pretty average, except recalling sentences. He had difficulty. Was it the stuttering? Was it the executive functioning? I don't know, but I wanted to uncover what it is. The expository language sample really gave me a lot, and I based a lot of the goals there. Parents were complaining about the run-on sentences, and he did have a lot of amazing 2 standard deviations higher. He also had a lot of errors, and I did talk to him, and we found a lot of those errors were just word swap changes. Even if the grammar was wrong, he would swap words to avoid stuttering. And so that is the case history there. I wanted to definitely leave time for cognitive affective, because this is a huge part with this boy. Here are some ones you can use that you'll have to buy. Camella and Reardon book is informal tasks you can do. You can get it from the Stuttering Foundation for like $10. Oasis is what maybe a lot of schools have. It's what I often use. If you're working with preschoolers and your school has that, you could use it. I don't tend to use it for preschool. I just use informal things, but these are more things you have to buy. And free cognitive ones, if your school has SSI 4, Chapter 4, look at the clinical use of self-reports. There's a set of rating scales for speakers that uncovers a lot of thoughts, feelings, and attitudes. And I have 2 sites. I love the communication attitude test. And I use that maybe with some younger kids who stutter or clutter, because it doesn't use the word stuttering. Not that that's a bad word at all to use, but sometimes I just want to use a shorter test for maybe some child with atypical dysfluency. I would use the communication attitude test, or cluttering, or a child who I find that maybe the Oasis would be too long at this point. I'll do that. So I think what I did is I just minimized it, and then so we've done the free ones, and I have some questions that I often use. You can just not even use something, but have an interview, especially if a child is willing to talk. Important thing here, since we're running out of time, I won't go through these questions, but if a child says something like, do you like talking in class, or no, it's kind of hard, follow-up questions are really important to ask, such as, what does that mean it's hard? Don't assume that he's talking about stuttering. He might be thinking something else is hard, that everyone talks louder than him, or for example. But if he does bring up stuttering, you'd say, well, what does that mean to you? What does it look and sound like? So these follow-up questions, I've given you some here, can be really important. Don't make assumptions that you understand what the child means. Follow up with that and see their level of awareness. Do you know why it happens? What do you do when it happens? It's the sense of curiosity, and then we can talk about this. It's so important to start off on that foot with the child. In this case study, there weren't a bunch of huge things that stood out to me on the OASIS. He was kind of mild moderate, but you remember he is a child with autism, on the autism spectrum, and sometimes he misses some social cues. He may enter into social situations with a lot less breaks than maybe a typically developing child. And I did stand out that he knew nothing about stuttering. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, these parents were dealing with childhood cancer. We were dealing with autism. They were dealing with lots of things. And now it's like, okay, let's look at the stuttering of it. Now it's become more of a concern. So that didn't surprise me there. And I went a little bit deeper for him because I felt he needed more structure. I felt he wasn't really aware when I was giving him the self about stuff. So I gave him this scale. I just happened to have it. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but it gave a whole bunch of specific situations. And he scored actually higher than non-stutterers. But interestingly, his scores were off really high on situations that were a little bit atypical for a child without stuttering. He didn't want to tell his teacher his name and address, or the police officer your home address, or ordering food in a fast food restaurant. So I use that, and that we use that as a springboard to talk about his avoidances of stuttering. Another thing I do, and it's not like something I have to do, when I give the case study, I give a temperament scale. It's the Thomas and Chess is the one that I use, and there is a link. I want to just specify that when I talk about temperament, there's no right temperament to have. It can be just a goodness of fit. A child with ADHD on the basketball court would be great, but maybe not so much in a quiet classroom. Temperament can be stable over time. And again, I don't know why this is moving so quickly on me. I'm not touching the mouse, promise. But the temperament, here's some factors that are linked to increased stuttering. And we don't really know. There's a lot of questions still. There's ongoing research about temperament. But I find that children who are more reactive, both to good and positive things and negative things, more intensity of their reaction. I'm finding that more often with the children I work with who stutter, and some sensitivity. And then indeed, here's the link to the 9 characteristics of temperament, that if you wanted to give that rating scale and find out a little bit about what temperament they have. For this child, sensitivity was, he had a low threshold. That means little things would set him off a little bit more, like textures or noise. More distractible, tend towards more of the negative on mood, a little bit less adaptable. So things like this would be incorporated into therapy. Ending is a way to think about it. Kristen Camella had me think about tying up my assessment by stating 3 parts. 1, the fluency problem and other speech language problems if present. So he has a severe impairment. It's determined by the SSI-4. More disfluencies during, here this case would be mild impairment according to SSI-4. More disfluencies shown on single word answers, or where he's not able to change the words, such as reading or imitating sentences. And then describing contributing factors, the executive functioning piece, the autism spectrum piece are there. And communication discrepancies. Again, I might cite those linguistic discrepancies that are things that we'd want to work on. There's also another way to look at it, and This is a nice acronym to remember, that the CALMS model saying that your assessment should incorporate cognitive. What is the child thinking about their stuttering? What is the family thinking? What's affective, their thoughts and emotions. And I gave you those checklists and samples of tests, their language skills, definitely the motor component, phonology, speech sound disorders, and the stuttering, which stuttering's not a motor speech disorder, but you could look at the motor component as the amount and frequency of the frequency and duration of stuttering. And then social contribution, and I want to consider adding the sensory component. Usually there's some sensory differences that can be a contributing factor to the disfluency. So this child ended up then being qualified because it became really apparent to the teacher that if he's avoiding saying specific words, and he's developing a maladaptive communication style because of the stuttering, let's get in. But we didn't just work on stuttering, we worked on having the son understand the father, and have the father figure out how to work with the son so that they were in synchrony. And I put this slide in that if you have any question and you're thinking that would be neat to be a board certified specialist, certainly we need you. You have my contact information on the previous slide, so you are welcome to contact me if you would like more information on becoming board certified. And with that, I will should I stop my share and you want to share?
There are two things. One is I want you to show the rubric for fluency that you're putting together. And then the other was someone is saying, oh my gosh, how in the world can you do all of these things? How can you, it's thorough, it's complete. How do we optimize our time in order to do essential pieces of this assessment?
I think that's a great question. And really, it seems like a lot of pieces, but a lot of those can be our rating scales that you're having someone else do and you're collecting. So you're almost secretarial for that. And then I always, I don't think I emphasized it enough, but I'll not give a separate hierarchy, but I'll use the tasks from self to say, oh, look at how he performs here. So the self repeating sentences, I might get some language information by the standard score, but I'm also then analyzing the fluency on that measure. So I'm not giving two different things. I'm not doing a separate sentence repetition task, for example. And I think that's more key towards kind of older elementary, middle, and high school, because there could be more of avoidance. And we don't want to overlook these kids who are avoiding, because it's going to come out in self-confidence, feelings about themselves as a communicator. And with this thing, it could come out with disorganized language in the attempt to avoid stuttering. So I guess you also have, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrea, 60 days to do the evaluation. So you've got time to kind of collect those things. I often sometimes had them blocked in my schedule for a while. So I would have a half hour. Sometimes in high school, you have to have the 50 minutes. I might have had 2 subsequent weeks where I'm doing that. If you're getting a home sample, it's more just those emails to get that. But a lot of those are rating scales, case history, things you'd have to do for the red meeting anyway. Yes, it's more, but your payday. I mean, I will admit, I have a love-hate relationship with evaluations. When I get a referral, it's like, oh gosh, it is a lot of work, and especially the write-up. But when you're done, you can really feel like you know this child, and you're not making up goals. You're knowing what areas of discrepancy are for that child. Maybe it's oral reading, maybe the child wants to ask more questions in class, you can target a specific functional area that you identified as more problematic for that child, and use that for a goal, and you'll have a better picture of what specific things this child needs for treatment. So the payoff is there in terms of making your treatment easier, in my opinion.
Thanks, Laura. So why don't you, what Laura has on her screen right now is similar to the speech rubric that we adopted from Virginia Department of Ed. We have a language one on our website as well, or she's in the process of creating a rubric to guide teams or to guide SLPs in interpreting or thinking about how does this impact the students. So on the left side, and it's kind of hard to see, I don't know if you can make it bigger, Laura, but on the left side, there's no apparent impact, there's minimal impact, moderate, substantial impact. And then, she identified what goes across the columns as the areas that we need to really think about. Obviously information from academic and other settings, information from the description of the disfluency, amount and level of disfluency, associated non-vocal behaviors, and then feelings and attitudes. And so again, it's coming, it's being adapted. It'll be a tool for you all to use to then look at, no one's going to fit a profile all the way across. You probably will have some kids that are no apparent impact all the way across, perhaps, but they're going to be dipping into other areas. And so it's not, these are not hard and fast. This is, where does the preponderance of evidence tell you or lead you to?
Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, you don't have to, get it all across one area. But what I wanted to add that Virginia didn't have is this idea of feelings and attitudes, looking at that piece, because that's really important for children who stutter, and that they had put down data sources more academic, like the spelling and the reading, but I feel that we really should look at it weighted more towards that oral participation piece for kids who stutter. That's not to say, children who stutter are children, and some of them are going to have a harder time academically, and some of them will not have a harder time academically. So, you want to look at the whole child. But I find that for the stuttering usually impacts oral participation, and that is an academic need. If they're not saying the right answer in class because they're avoiding the specific content word, that's an academic liability. There's no level playing field for that child compared to the other children there.
Thanks a lot for spending your Thursday.